And welcome back to Madison, Wisconsin, with Texas Senator and Republican presidential candidate Ted Cruz. I want to get right now to our audience, some of whom have questions for the good senator. I want to take it first to Lee Meyer of Madison, who has a question about abortion.
Thank you. I consider myself a moderate Republican, and I'm pro-choice. One of my fears and concerns is that if you become president, you may make abortion illegal nationwide. So what's your message to me and other women and men regarding that issue and that fear?
Well, Lee, thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming out. You know, the issue of life has been an issue that has torn this country apart for many, many decades. And my view, I am pro-life. I believe that we should protect every human life, and we should protect every life from the moment of conception. And I will say there is more and more consensus we are seeing on this issue as we see, for example, people coming together to bar extreme practices, things like partial birth abortion, where we're seeing large consensuses of American people saying this practice is gruesome, it's barbaric. It is my hope that we see people's hearts and minds change. But this is an issue where it's going to take time for people's hearts and minds to change, that if you're going to change a major issue of public policy, the way to do so, I believe, is at the ballot box. You know, my whole life I've been a passionate defender of the Constitution. And I think judicial activism is wrong. One of the worst things about the Supreme Court in 1973, stepping in and seizing this issue, is it took it out of control of the people. It said that 5 unelected judges will decide this issue rather than 330 million Americans. I believe under our Constitution we have a democratic society, and that if someone wants to pass legislation limiting or expanding abortion, the way to do that is to convince your fellow citizens to make the case at the ballot box. And I think that ultimately is the check for both your views and my views, that you've got to convince our fellow citizens. But I think all of us should agree that it's a much better system to have important public policy issues decided by the people at the ballot box rather than 5 unelected lawyers just imposing their views on everybody else.
So is Roe v. Wade settled law in your view?
No, and I think it was a classic example of activism. Even
if that's true, though, here we are some 40 years later. What would President Cruz do about it?
Well, look, I think there's a great deal you can do. One of the things you can do, for example, is, and that I intend to do, is reimpose what are called the Mexico City rules that Ronald Reagan put in place that prohibit federal taxpayer dollars from funding abortions overseas, funding organizations.
What about domestically? There was this whole dust-up this week where Donald Trump came out and said he believed that women should be punished if abortion were made illegal. Yeah. And a woman had an abortion, that he believed women should be punished. Then he dialed that back and reversed himself on it. What's your view?
Well, look, I think the statement Donald Trump made this week really illustrates, I mean, it was a bizarre statement saying that he believed women should be punished. It showed that he's not considered seriously this issue or many of the issues facing this country, that he's really just willing to say whatever he can say to try to win votes. You know, part of being pro-life is valuing every human life, the unborn child, but also valuing the mother, celebrating the mother. I'll tell you, many times the victims of abortion are not just the unborn children who never get a chance to live, but it's the moms who are racked with guilt, and it has a great many women have suffered because of the tragedy of abortion, and we need to be celebrating and protecting all human life. And it was interesting. I thought one of the most insightful observations on this came from Jonah Goldberg at National Review, where he was talking about Donald's comments on abortion, and he said, these comments are the comments of a liberal who is trying to say what he thinks conservatives want to hear. So from a liberal's perspective, Donald, and Jonah was speculating, believes that conservatives want to hear punish women. Now, no conservative actually believes that, but if you're trying to pretend to be something you're not, you get the rhetoric wrong. You don't understand it. And Jonah analogized it to the KKK. You know, when Donald was doing an interview on CNN and was asked about David Duke, the former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, supporting him. And Donald refused to denounce the KKK in that interview. And Jonah said, listen, that's a liberal who thinks, well, gosh, conservatives don't want me to denounce the Klan. Now, listen, anyone that's actually a conservative is perfectly happy saying the Klan is evil, it is bigoted, it is wrong, it has no place in society. And if you're speaking from core convictions, you know that because you're speaking from the heart.
In defense of Mr. Trump, he had denounced it online at a press conference the previous Friday and then went on to do it again. But wait, I want to ask you just to follow up, because you don't favor a rape or an incest exception to abortion. And for people like Lee, this may be a problem in getting behind President Ted Cruz, that they think you may be too far right on social issues. Well,
listen, let's talk. You know, when it comes to rape, I've spent a lot of years in law enforcement. I was the Solicitor General of the state of Texas. And I have handled cases with horrific cases of rape, of people who committed child rape, people who, I mean, I went before the U.S. Supreme Court and argued in defense of state laws imposing capital punishment for the very worst child rapists. And when it comes to rape, rape is a horrific crime against the humanity of a person and needs to be punished, and punished severely. But at the same time, as horrible as that crime is, I don't believe it's the child's fault. And we weep at the crime. We want to do everything we can to prevent the crime on the front end and to punish the criminal, but I don't believe it makes sense to blame the child.
You know what the people who favor these exceptions say. They say you'd be forcing the mother to go through unspeakable trauma to carry her rapist baby for 9 months.
Well, I'll tell you as a practical matter, Megan, as I mentioned before in visiting with Lee, in order for any legislation to be passed on this topic, you have to convince your fellow citizens. That's ultimately the check in a democratic society, is you've got to convince 330 million Americans. And, you know, before Roe versus Wade, it was a question state by state. So here it would be a question for Wisconsin. What should the laws be governing abortion? If Roe versus Wade was not the law, it would be up to the people of Wisconsin to decide. And the people of Wisconsin might decide to allow some exceptions or not allow some exceptions. Everyone agrees that you always want to protect the life of the mother. But if you trust the people, it's one of the reasons why the Constitution and Bill of Rights can be such a unifying document and approach, because ultimately the Constitution entrusts the people with making these decisions, not having them forced on us by unelected judges. I
want to get this in. We have another questioner who wants to ask you about Obamacare, but we'll do that after the break. Let me ask you about religion, because you recently said the following, quote, "Those in politics have an obligation not to wear their faith on their sleeve." And a lot of people said, huh? Come again, Ted Cruz? Right? Because you've been out there regularly asking voters to pray that God will, quote, continue this awakening in this campaign. You regularly quote from Scripture on this stump, and you actually told your volunteers that they need to, quote, strap on the full armor of God. So how is that not wearing your religion on your sleeve?
Well, listen, number one, this is a point I've made for many, many years, that politicians, you know, there are far too many politicians who use religion as a cloak to hide who they are. And I think that's wrong. I think you have to be particularly careful against that. Now, I recognize that many in the media try to paint anyone who's a conservative, anyone who's actually a Christian, to paint them as some sort of crazy nut. I'm not going to hide my faith. I am a Christian. I'm going to acknowledge it. I am not going to be ashamed of Jesus.
Well, what's wearing it on your sleeve if not, you know, put on the full armor of God?
Well, let me give you an example. What I talk about every day on the campaign trail. I talk about jobs. I talk about freedom. I talk about security. I'm not running to be pastor-in-chief. I'm not asking you to elect me to be your pastor. It's not the job of the president to stand up and give a sermon, to evangelize. It's not the job of the president to tell people you're going to hell. That's not a president's job. No one wants to see a president trying to do that. It is the job of the president to be commander-in-chief, to defend this nation, to keep us safe, to defeat radical Islamic terrorism. It is the job of the president to fight against taxes and regulations that are killing small businesses and destroying jobs.
To be informed by your faith.
look,
inspired by it.
My faith is integral to who I am. But, you know, the great thing about the Bill of Rights, actually, we were talking a minute ago about the Bill of Rights. So I've done town halls where people stand up and say, I'm an atheist. Why should I support you? And you know what? The First Amendment, religious liberty, it's the very first liberty protected in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. It applies to everybody. It applies to Christians, but
you know what they're going to say? The atheists say, I don't want to have to sit there in the school setting and so on and have to participate or even watch as everyone stands up around me and says the pledge, which mentions God, or says a prayer after some function at school.
But the Constitution doesn't give you a heckler's veto. You don't have the right. No one forces you to participate in anything. You have the right not to participate. But you don't have the right to silence everybody else. And the First Amendment protects the religious liberty of Christians, of Jews, of Muslims, of atheists. Every one of us, we have a right to seek out and worship God, to live according to our own faith and conscience. If that's religious faith, you have the right to live according to that. If you're an atheist, you have the right to live according to that. And, you know, the amazing thing is, the left loves to preach tolerance and diversity. There is nothing so intolerant as a leftist who says, don't you dare say Jesus around me. I will not tolerate the name of Jesus. You know what? Live and let live. And recognize that Americans can choose to follow our own path.